So here will be some practice of finding special angle values of any of the 6 trig functions, of any angle that has a reference angle of 30, 45, or 60 in any of the 4 quadrants. And so the first thing that you want to remember is that you need to have the values in the first quadrant memorized. So this chart that we went over in class, and there's another video that shows where we get all these numbers from. Those numbers you either have to have memorized or be able to generate the triangle and the values fairly quickly. So I'm going to do 3 problems with you, and they're somewhat representative of the types of problems that you will be asked. And the first one would be something like this. If I asked you to find, let's say, the cotangent of 300 degrees, and that angle, the first thing that you want to do is, if the angle is already in the range of 0 to 360, you want to decide what quadrant the angle is in. And so the angle of 300 degrees is in the 4th quadrant, so that's quadrant 4. And then you want to find the reference angle, and the reference angle for 300 degrees is 60 degrees. Remember that your reference angles always go to the x-axis. So the reference angles are always going to be in the space to the x-axis. Okay. The next thing that you want to do is keep in mind you're saying that all sad turtles cry. All sad turtles cry. And that, remember, means that in the 4th quadrant, your cosine and secant are positive. I hesitated because I don't know why my highlighter isn't highlighting, but it's acting like a pen. Anyway, in the 4th quadrant, cosine and secant are positive. Everything else is negative. That means that your answer for the cotangent question in the 4th quadrant is going to have a negative answer. And then you want to ask yourself, what would the cotangent of 60 be? And remember that you know the numbers from this table up above, and so the cotangent of 60 is radical 3 over 3. Well, 60 is in the 1st quadrant, so when cotangent is in the 4th quadrant, it's negative, so the cotangent of 300 is negative radical 3 over 3. So the answer to the first question is negative radical 3 over 3. Now, I could give you a question, for example, that asks for an angle that's bigger than 360. So let's say that I asked you for, how about the secant of 585 degrees. Now, remember that I am going to be giving you angles to memorize the values, or to be able to come up with the values without a calculator, that all come back to a reference angle of 30, 45, or 60. And so in this case, you're going to have to start by subtracting 585 minus 360 to find the coterminal angle that is in the range 0 to 360. So this angle has a coterminal angle of 225. And so I'm going to draw that angle, and 225 will be in the 3rd quadrant. Remember that you want to give the directional arrow. But you want to find the reference angle for 225, and that's going to be a 45-degree angle. So although the original angle is 585, and then we drew a coterminal angle of 225, the reference angle is just that space to the x-axis, and that's going to be that 45-degree angle. So then the next question is, based on all sad turtles cry, is secant positive or negative in the third quadrant? Well, secant's going to be negative because only tangent and cotangent are positive in the third quadrant. So your answer to secant of 585 is negative. And then again, you need to be able to remember the secant of 45 degrees. And it's on this table up here. The secant of 45 degrees is radical 2. And so your secant of 585 degrees is negative radical 2. And then what if I gave you a negative angle? So let's say, for example, that I asked you to find the sine of negative 210 degrees. So again, you want to draw the angle, and remember that negative angles have a clockwise rotation. The positive angles have a counterclockwise rotation, and negative angles have a clockwise rotation. If halfway around the circle is 180, then a little bit past halfway would be 210. And so this angle here is negative 210 degrees, and that's going to be in the second quadrant. But remember that your reference angle is just to the x-axis, and that's going to be 30 degrees. So we're looking at sine in the second quadrant, and all sad turtles cry tell me that sine and cosecant are positive in the second quadrant. So my answer to this question is going to be positive. And so I'm thinking to myself, what is the sine of 30? The sine of 30 is 1/2. And so the sine of negative 210 is going to be positive 1/2. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is that although we can give you any angle in the four quadrants, we can give you any angle that's bigger than 360, we can give you negative angles as long as the reference angles come back to 30, 45, or 60. We can also give you any of these problems as radians. So I started this video by saying that I would give you 3 problems, but maybe I'll give you 1 or 2 more. So let's try fourth problem. How about, I'm making these up as I go along. How about the cosecant of 11 pi over 6? So you don't have to, every time you do one of these problems, you don't really need to convert everything back to degrees. If you know just 30, 45, and 60. So here's what I'm talking about. 11 pi over 6 is just shy of 12 pi over 6. 12 pi over 6 would be 2 pi, which is the entire circle. 2 pi, remember, is the same as 360 degrees. So 11 pi over 6 is going to be a little bit less than that. That's 11 pi over 6. And the reference angle here to the x-axis is just going to be 1 pi over 6. Well, that's 30 degrees. And so all I need to do now is decide on the sign, positive or negative, and figure out what's the cosecant of 30 degrees. So the sign, remember, comes back to all sad turtles cry. So in the fourth quadrant, cosine and secant are positive and everything else is negative. So your cosecant in the fourth quadrant is going to be negative. And then the cosecant of 30 degrees from our table is going to be 2. And so in the fourth quadrant, the cosecant of 11 pi over 6 is negative 2. And you didn't ever really need to compute what exactly does 11 pi over 6 equal? Because you could figure out the value of the cosecant just from using the reference angle. The reference angle for anything with a denominator of 4 is going to be 45, and the reference angle of anything with a denominator of 3 is going to be 60. The reference angle of anything with a denominator of 6 is going to be 30. As long as the fraction is completely simplified to start with, those reference angles will always work. One more example just to show you how that works. So number 5, let's say that I ask you to find the cosine of, let's say, 5 pi over 4. You need to at least be able to figure out what quadrant we're looking at. So 5 pi over 4. Remember that 4 pi over 4 is 180 degrees. So 5 pi over 4 will be in the third quadrant, just a little bit past the 180 degrees, 5 pi over 4. And that your reference angle is just the space from the terminal side of the angle to the x-axis. Remember that the reference angle is always just going to be that same denominator. So pi over the same denominator, that's 45 degrees. All sad turtles cry. All sad turtles cry. In the third quadrant, tangent and cotangent are positive, so cosine will be negative. And the cosine of pi over 4, the cosine of 45 is radical 2 over 2. And so the cosine of 5 pi over 4 is negative radical 2 over 2.